Good morning, everybody, and good morning to those who are watching online as well. As Tom said, I have been here for about 2.5 weeks, so the chances are that I haven't met you yet, but I would love to meet you. Please do chat to me or to James afterwards. I'm just going to publicly embarrass myself and admit that I am a massive fan of cheesy family musicals. And one of my favourite films growing up was Sister Act. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a classic 90s tale with Whoopi Goldberg, who plays a nightclub singer who then becomes a nun in order to escape from her murderous boyfriend. It's a great storyline. And part of her transformation is seen very strikingly from what she wears, as she dons the nun's habit, this kind of black robe and wimple. And when I was thinking about this sermon series, which we've called the 7 Highly Effective Habits of Christians, it really struck me that a habit is not just something that you do, but can also be something that you wear. And last week, Tom spoke about speaking Jesus, about breathing in and breathing out Jesus. And my topic for this morning is generosity. And as we think about generosity, I would love it if we could not think about it as something that we do, something that we pick up from time to time, but as a habit that we wear, that we are clothed in, a mindset even. And if you think back to the early church in Acts, they were known for their radical generosity. It was something that really marked them out as followers of Jesus. And this morning, we're looking at this habit through the lens of this widow from Zarephath. And it's a story which I find incredibly moving. This woman who chose to give and be generous despite her circumstances. And we'll look at the why, the what, the how, and finally the who of generosity. So to begin with the why be generous? Why is my phone constantly full of notifications from lovely people at Ascension asking if they can still have time to bring clothes to the swap shop? Why do we give? It's very simple. We give because Jesus has asked us to, because it's a Jesus thing to do. A generous person will prosper, so says Proverbs. And as we read this story, I think you can see that there is a very simple faith and obedience running all the way through it. Take a look at Elijah. He's living in a time of drought, not of petrol, but of water. And he is on the run from this evil king, Ahab, and his wife, Jezebel. And they want to kill him. And then the word of the Lord comes to him, and he says, go to Zarephath, which is in this place called Sidon. And actually, this is where Jezebel is from. So God is basically telling Elijah to go deep into the heart of the enemy's territory. So far, so strange. And then he says, go and find a widow. And if you know anything about the culture of the time, a widow would have had the lowest status and the lowest means of income. So this is both the least likely place and the least likely person. And it is this person who provides Elijah with what he needs. Go and give me some food and some drink, he says. And she replies, well, actually, I don't have anything. I'm about to die. And reading this, you kind of expect that Elijah will take pity on her and maybe provide a miraculous loaf of bread. But instead, he says, don't be afraid. Let's listen to what God is saying first. And then let's join in with what God is doing. And she too, she responds in faithful obedience. And the word of the Lord is fulfilled. And the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry. How generous, how ridiculous, how very typical of the upside-down kingdom, where our God can take a very little and turn it into a lot. And this is the joy of kingdom living. And it's the same kind of joy that I've seen in the last week. We had a group of refugees come into the church earlier this week, and they spent the whole morning in the church, and their kids were running around playing with Duplo, pretending to shoot each other. And they noticed the swap shop over there, which sort of humbly began as part of Green Week, but it became a means of provision for them and their family. And I love that. It's the little that gets turned into a lot. And generally, when we think about generosity, I think the first thing that comes to mind is money. But I want to suggest that generosity is far more than giving money, and I'm not going to talk about that at all this morning. It's the mindset of saying, I am here for others. So what can I bring? We're generous because it's what Jesus has asked us of us. That's why we give. But what do we give? What has God given me? Like the widow, what is the thing in my hand? Because putting on the habit, having the mindset of what can I bring, what can I share, how can I be a blessing to those around me, it's a really serious question. Just like Elijah and the widow, it's an exercise of faith. To really seriously consider, to pray about how can we use our resources, our talents, how can we use our living rooms even. Because, and I wonder if most especially, it's how can we use our time. Because it's costly. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes said in 1930 that by 2030, technology would be so advanced that we would only be working 3 hours a day. I don't know about you, but I work a lot more than 3 hours a day. And not only are we increasingly time poor, but we have these things, and we can be contacted 24 hours a day. And I think in 21st century London, it is increasingly hard to be generous with your time. And then along comes the church minister to ask, so how are you serving in church? A friend of mine told me a joke recently that sometimes people think of church as being like a giant helicopter. They don't want to get too close in case they get sucked into the rotors. But if we give from a place of willing and faithful obedience to what God has asked of us, and that means we are exercising faith. And I wonder how or what God might be stirring in you this morning by his Spirit. You know, there's a reason Elijah has to say, don't be afraid. At some level, whenever we exercise faith, we are always having to combat fear. Generosity is costly, right? And sharing what you have, living to put others first, means that you are putting yourself second. And it's a very Jesus thing to do, but it means we're always going to have to fight the fear that will combat faith. And the fear that says that faith won't win, that God can't possibly pull this off. Or the enemy whispering in your ear that Jesus isn't really worth it. And if you choose to give, there won't be enough for you as well. You know, generosity is a deeply countercultural way of life, and I think that's why God holds it so highly. And all the way along, it's bred into us that we shouldn't live this way. You know, we have the mantras of survival of the fittest, or it's a dog-eat-dog world out here, or get ahead, stay ahead, or we're not in the charity business. And I remember hearing that in my old job. Selfishness is almost bred into us from when we're children. But reading this story, for the first time, did anybody think on the surface it looks like Elijah is kind of selfishly demanding food for himself first when this family is starving? But actually, when we read it, you can see that he is responding in faith to what God has asked. And Elijah, he knows that God will provide. And the corresponding faith that he finds in this poor widow is astounding. I just find this story so moving. And it's a lesson to not be afraid to put Jesus first. And the habit of generosity, of putting Jesus first by sharing with others, giving him our best, giving him our first. The Israelites traditionally symbolize this by the first fruits. And actually the harvest festival that we have here goes all the way back to the Old Testament in the Bible, when they gave the best and the first of the harvest to God. And that is the origin of what we're celebrating today. And it is a celebration. And there's such a difference, isn't there, between the kind of scarcity mindset, the poverty spirit that says, I'm going to grasp onto things and not share out of the fear of there not being enough, and this habit of generosity that freely gives. And that habit, I think it comes from a place of abundance, a place of faith. One of the most generous people that I know is my godmother. She's also a priest, and she's been a huge example to me. And when I quit my old job in the art world, I had a pay reduction of, 80% or something. And I couldn't afford to live in my old flat anymore, and my accommodation fell through. And she said, come and live with me. And it was one of those classic cases of stay for 3 months until Christmas, see how we're going. And I ended up being there for over a year and a half. And she is incredibly kind. But when I moved in there, which I didn't know straight away, was that actually she had another lady living with her who was a refugee from West Africa. And Sue and her family, they have this relationship that's been ongoing for a really long time with a charity called Housing for Justice. And it's not the first time they've had someone come and stay with them. And this wasn't easy generosity. It was costly. It was messy as brokenness and vulnerability and culture clashes came together. But it was also glorious, and it was Christian life and community. And the thing is that whole family, some of the most generous people that I know, in really every way. It's a culture that has gone down from parents to children and now to grandchildren as well. And I kind of look at that and I'm like, that's the kind of family I want to have. And it also makes me think that as Christians, we talk a lot about social justice or caring for our community. But when we walk the talk, the world sits up and takes notice, right? And it's when the church begins to look like church, this extreme generosity. It's when it starts to sound and behave and smell a bit like Jesus. Because generous living is a reflection and a celebration of God's character. And obviously not all of us are in the position of having 2 spare rooms to give out, but all of us are stewards of what God has given us. All of us have our talents. We have our flour and we have our oil. So why do we give? Because it's what Jesus has asked. What do we give? Well, what is in your hand? And how do we give? We give out of the economy of God's kingdom. And in the kingdom of God, there is always enough. There was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and for her family. The jar of flour, it was not used up, and the jug of oil, it did not run dry. This habit of generosity, it is the receiving in and the giving out of kingdom abundance. And isn't it amazing that act of generosity in the most unlikely place from the most unlikely person resulted in an abundance and in provision for the widow and her family? Isn't that just like Jesus? The one who took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed 5,000 people. The one who took water at a wedding and turned it into the very best of wine. He is the one who promises to give us life in all of its fullness, who takes the little that we have and can multiply it to so much more. And so we give from a place of abundance. And when I was in Parish Coffee, I asked someone, I'm not going to embarrass them by saying who, but I asked someone what words they would use to describe Ascension. And he immediately said kindness and a non-judgmental welcome. And can I say I agree? James and I have been so blessed by the welcome that we have received in the short time that we've been here. And especially there's this real desire to really serve our community here in Balham. And it is spoken to me so much of the generosity of spirit, which is the love of Jesus. And the other thing that has stood out to me about Ascension is the real integrity that we have here. And Coretta Scott King, who was the wife of Martin Luther King, she said that the greatness of a community is accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. And when I met Marcus for the first time, I asked him what Ascension was about, and he said very simply, we just want to love people. And compassionate actions, they aren't, they're not just the big ones, the grand ones that make the headlines. It's often the little things that make a real difference in someone's life. When you deliberately go out of your way to notice people, that's when they feel the most loved. And James and I, when we were talking about generosity this week and what I was going to say in the sermon, we both ended up talking about time and how we have felt the most built up in our faith by people who have taken the time to walk alongside us. And for James, he has this mentor called David, and I have a lady called Sarah I often talk to, and these people both have super busy jobs, they both have children, and they have very little time. And we've really felt that they have given so self-sacrificially to us. So I've talked about the why and the how and the what of generosity. But if I can I end on the who, which is kind of going back to the why. Because the who is us. It's a we, right? And church is nearly always about the we, and very rarely a focus on the I. And it's an us because of Jesus. Ultimately, why do we give? We give out of a response of what God has done for us. That's what we were singing in the worship earlier. Generosity is ultimately about love. It's living from the overflow of what God has done for us, sharing what we have received so freely because we were loved first. The who is Jesus. And we come to church for other people because we are one body gathered here today, a family, and that's why we're going to feast on jacket potatoes together shortly. But the who is Jesus. Jesus, who said in John's Gospel that if we love one another, then the whole world will know that we are his disciples. And generosity, if it's ultimately about love can be this overflow of joy, which expands to draw others in despite the cost. And what I love about church is the way that you get all these different people gathered together and you get to see them all doing those different things that they're really good at, like leading in worship or like doing all the tech stuff. And I'm so glad and grateful for those people who willingly share those talents. Because if church was made up of people just like me, not only would it be incredibly boring, but none of that stuff would happen. There would be no worship, no camera, no lights, and no action. And God, he has brought us together this morning to glorify him. And among us, he has distributed different gifts, different talents, like serving, like administration, like leadership, like teaching or prophecy or hospitality. And Marcus touched on this 2 weeks ago, but when one of us doesn't turn up with our gift and share it, then actually the body, it is incomplete. And I wonder what God is stirring in you to give, what he might be inviting you to in obedient faith, what you have in your hand that he's asking you to share. And maybe that's a physical thing, maybe that's a skill, maybe that's time spent with a person that you're being asked to pray for and invest in. Maybe it's committing to the monthly prayer meeting coming up. Maybe it's stepping into that prophetic gifting to bless others. The widow in Zarephath, she shared what she had in simple faith and obedience, and the kingdom came. And I'd like to end by reading some words from the New Testament that were written by Peter. And he wrote it to a church community that was really struggling. They were being persecuted and they had really, really few resources. And he called them back to the simple truth of the gospel and to service. And he said this: "The end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind so that you can pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have to receive to serve others, as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Amen.